It's great to be with you again. Let me see if I've got this mic turned on here. Let me get this going right quick. Open your Bible, if you would, please, to the book of Job. The book of Job, chapter 32. Roger, do I have it on correctly now? All right. Can't hear it? You need to turn it up? All right. Roger, they said you need to turn it up just there you go. How about that? You hear that now? All right. Thank you so much. Job chapter 32 is where we're going to begin this morning. It's great to be back in your church. I've lost track of how many times. I'll have to look at my records and see how many times I've been here. It's somewhere between 500 and 700. I don't remember exactly how many, but it's been quite a few times that I've always enjoyed. And then last year, when we took our trip to Israel, several of the people here in the church got to go with us, and that was very delightful to get to spend some extra time. I'm in a different church almost every week of the year, and sometimes 2 or 3 different churches in the same week. And so I just pop in and I see some friends, and I get to spend a day or 2 with them, and then I'm gone again. But get to go to Israel together and spend a whole week together last year, that was very delightful. I was glad that some of the folks got to go. Most of us know that there's a man in the Bible by the name of Job. At one time, Job was one of the wealthiest and one of the wisest men in what we call the Middle East. The Bible refers to it as the East. But he was one of the wealthiest and wisest men in that part of the world at that particular time. And one day, God and Satan were having a conversation. They were talking to each other, and they were talking about Job. And Satan said to God, "Would you mind if I move this one microphone while I'm teaching? We can put it back after I'm done, if that's all right." All right, thank you. Satan said to God, "Well, sure, anybody would love you if you treat them as good as you treat Job." And God said to Satan, "Okay, here's what I'll do. I'll let you do anything you want to Job, except kill him, and we'll see if he still loves me or not." Now, this is not the part of the story that I'm teaching on this morning, but you know the story how Job lost all of his wealth in one day's time. He lost his health. All 10 of his children died in one day. And he passed the test. He still loved God even after all of that happened. But again, that's not the part of the story I'm teaching on this morning. During the time that Job was suffering through all of that tragedy that happened, he had 3 friends that came to visit him. And those 3 friends came supposedly to comfort him. And it seems to me, it seems that they had some sincerity, that they were wanting to comfort Job to some extent when they first got there. But it turned out they didn't comfort him quite as much as we really would have wished they had. And again, that's not the lesson this morning, but here's the thing. In chapter 2, Job and his 3 friends begin to have this conversation. And this conversation lasts all the way from Job chapter 2 through Job chapter 31. It's this big, long conversation. The Bible doesn't tell us specifically if it lasted all day one day or if it lasted a few days. It seems like it was over a period of a few weeks maybe. But they had this big, long conversation. Now we come down to Job chapter 32. And Job chapter 32, the 5th person in the story. And when I make that statement, the 5th person in the story, don't get the wrong impression. This is not a story like a storybook. This is not a fictional story that somebody wrote. This is an historical event that actually happened. In fact, the Bible is the most accurate historical book that's ever been written. Everything in the Bible that it says happened, it really did happen. Like there really was a George Washington, there really was a Job. Like there really was an Abraham Lincoln, there really was a Paul the Apostle. It's a very accurate historical book. And so when I say the fifth person in the story, I mean it might be more accurate to say the fifth person in the event that took place. His name is Elihu. Elihu shows up in Job chapter 32. And when I say he shows up in Job chapter 32, that's not exactly accurate. In Job chapter 32 is the first time he's mentioned. He's actually been there the whole time, and we'll see that in a moment. During this big long conversation between Job and his three friends, this fifth person, Elihu, was there. He heard this whole conversation, but he never speaks up. He never says anything. There's nothing said about him until Job chapter 32. All right, so we'll begin in Job chapter 32 with verse 1. Verse 1 says, "So these three men," Job's three friends that we spoke of a moment ago, "so these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite." Would you look at me for a second? I want to point out here, the very first thing we're told about Elihu is that his wrath is kindled, or in our culture today, we would say he was very angry. Or he had maybe lost his temper, we might say it that way. Look at verse 2. "Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite, of the kindred of Ram. Against Job was his wrath kindled, because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his three friends was his wrath kindled, because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job." Verse 4. "Now Elihu had waited till Job had spoken, because they were elder than he." All right, look at me for a second. The second thing I want to point out to you, first thing is Elihu is very angry. His wrath is kindled. We've been told three times already his wrath is kindled. The second thing we learn about Elihu is that he's the youngest man of the five. It said that they, Job and his three friends, were elder than he, or we would say older than he was. So he's the youngest man of the five in the story. All right, let's continue reading. I'm going to go back now, and I'm going to pick up the story in verse 5. Verse 4 said, "Now Elihu had waited till Job had spoken, because they were elder than he." Verse 5. "When Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, then his wrath was kindled." That's the fourth time we've been told that his wrath was kindled. Are you beginning to get the idea? I think this kid had lost his temper. He's the youngest guy in the group, and he's out of control. I mean, we've been told four times now that his wrath is kindled, that he's very, very angry. All right, verse 6. "And Elihu the son of Barachel the Buzite answered and said, I am young, and ye are very old. Wherefore I was afraid, and durst not, or dared not, show you mine opinion." So Elihu is admitting, because I'm the youngest one in the group, I haven't said anything up to this point. Now look at verse 7. "I said," this is Elihu still speaking, "I said, days should speak." Or those who have lived more days than me should be the ones doing the speaking. "And multitude of years should teach wisdom." Or what he's saying is, I know I'm the youngest one in the group, so I let those of you who have lived more days than me speak first, because I understand that the four of you have lived a multitude of years more than I have, and so you're the ones that ought to be teaching the wisdom. That's what Elihu is saying up to this point. Okay, now look at verse 8. "But there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding. Great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment." Now, would you look at me just for a second? I'm sure somewhere along the line, your pastor or some other preacher has made the statement to you that you can rarely ever take any one verse in the Bible and pull it out of context and look at it all by itself and fully understand everything that verse is trying to teach. Verse 9 right there that we just read is a perfect example of that. If you take verse 9 all by itself and look at it, just verse 9, not the rest of the story, and you read the statement, great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment, it almost sounds like verse 9 is contradicting most of the rest of the Bible. How many times have we read in the Bible that one generation ought to teach the next generation? I mean, how many times do we see in the book of Proverbs when Solomon says, my son, give me thine ear. My son, give me thine heart. My son, hear my words. My son, listen to your mother's law. Even in the New Testament, the Bible tells us that the aged women should teach the younger women to be keepers at home and so forth. So if you take verse 9 by itself, it sounds like it's contradicting the rest of the Bible. But what you have to understand, in order to understand any portion of the Bible, to fully understand it, you have to know who's speaking, who they're speaking to, what they're talking about, and what's going on in that particular time or location. Okay, you take a newspaper or a magazine, you pick it up, you close your eyes and point and touch one sentence in that article, and you read that one sentence, you think you're going to understand what the article's talking about? No, you have to understand what's going on around it. So verse 9, okay, now, don't kick me off the platform when I make this next statement. Listen to my whole speech here before you Brother Roger, don't turn my microphone off after this next statement. Verse 9 is not teaching great men are not always wise. Verse 9 is not teaching neither do the aged understand judgment. Verse 9 is recording the fact that a young man who had lost his temper blurted out that statement to some older men at whom he was angry. There's many places in the Bible where somebody makes a statement that is not truth, but it is true he made that statement, and the Bible records the fact that he made the statement. Okay, and so this young man, the youngest guy in the group, who had lost his temper, he blurts out this statement to these older men. He says, great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. Now look at verse 10. Therefore I said, hearken to me, I also will show mine opinion. Now if you look down at verse 17. Verse 17, Elihu is still speaking, and Elihu says, I said, I will answer also my part. I also will show mine opinion. That's the third time now that he has warned these older men that he's about to give his opinion. Look at verse 18. For I am full of matter, the spirit within me constraineth me. Behold, my belly is as wine which hath no vent. It is ready to burst like new bottles. Would you look at me again for a moment? When I see the word bottle or bottles, I don't know about you, but I think of plastic or glass, but they didn't have plastic bottles back then. When he speaks of a bottle, he's referring to a leather bottle. I don't understand how they did it, but somehow they could stitch leather together in such a way that it would hold liquid. And what he's saying there is, if you put new wine, or we'd call it grape juice, in a leather bottle, in a bottle made out of leather, and you don't vent the top, as that grape juice ferments and it creates the gas, the bubbles, that leather bottle's going to swell. Remember when your mother used to have one of those old pressure cookers and it had that little thing on the top that would spin around and the steam would come out every once in a while? It was letting the pressure off as it built on the... Okay, what he's saying there is, if you put this grape juice in this leather bottle and seal the top, as it expands, it's going to eventually explode. And what he's saying is, that's the way I feel right now. There is something on the inside of me, and I feel like if I can't get it out, I'm going to explode. Have you ever had an opinion that you wanted to give? Have you ever had an opinion that you wanted to tell somebody? In fact, every one of us have an opinion about everything. One day I was at my house, and a different house than we live in now, but at that time we lived in a house that was 2 levels, and it had an open stairwell between the 2 levels. And a repairman and I were up in the kitchen, and we were working on something, and my wife was downstairs. And I leaned over the top railing of the stairs, and I kind of yelled down to the lower level, and I said, sweetheart, would you want to come up here and give us your opinion about? She said, yes. And I said, what do you mean yes? I haven't even told you what it's about. She said, doesn't matter. I want to give you my opinion. And we're all that way. Hey, don't leave me up here on an island by myself. You've been there before. We've all got an opinion about everything, and we all want to tell somebody. Have you ever been to the point to where you were just dying to give your opinion, and you felt like if you didn't, you were about to explode? Okay, he is saying the same thing that we say today in our culture. We just word it differently. In our culture, we say, I just want to get it off my chest. Or he's just getting it off his chest. Well, Elihu is saying, I want to get it out of my belly. He's saying the same thing that we say, just wording it differently in a different culture. All right, let's continue reading. I'm going to go back to verse 18. For I am full of matter, the spirit within me constraineth me. Behold, my belly is as wine which hath no vent. It is ready to burst like new bottles. I will speak, and right here, this right here reveals the whole matter. I will speak that I may be refreshed. I will open my lips and answer. Have you ever been there? Have you ever had an opinion and you were dying to tell somebody? And when you finally got your chance and you got it off your chest, you relieved of that pressure that was on the inside of you, you felt better, right? Have you been there? Again, don't leave me up here by myself. Have you been there? Has that ever happened to you? And Elihu is admitting to these older men at whom he's angry, I'm going to tell you how I feel about it so that I will feel better. And I've been there and I've done that too many times. Because the problem is, yes, I feel better when I give you my opinion. But the problem is those who heard my opinion usually don't feel better. And Elihu is admitting, I want to give you my opinion so that I may be refreshed. Elihu wanted these older men to respect his opinion. That's why he warned them 3 times, I'm about to give you my opinion. He was getting them ready. He wanted them to listen. He wanted them to pay attention to what he had to say. Aren't we all that way? If we have an opinion and we're going to give it, don't we want somebody to listen? Don't you hate it when you finally get your chance to give your opinion and the person you're talking to is not listening? He was trying to get their attention. And also, this young man knew that these older men had more days, more years on him, had more wisdom than him, and so he criticized their opinion first to bring it down a notch or two so there'd be a better chance that his opinion could be on the same level and it could be respected by these older men. Every one of us, when we have an opinion, we hope somebody will respect that opinion. You know, the Bible is not just a mysterious book about some spooky place off out there in La La Land somewhere. The Bible is a very practical, hands-on manual on how to live life here on this earth. And even something as practical as, how do I get people to respect my opinion? You know the answer to that question's in the Bible. In fact, every problem that you and I will ever face here on this earth in this lifetime, the answer to every one of those problems is in that book right there. I am not claiming that I've found all of them, but they're all in there. Every single one of them. So, one time in the 22 years, for 22 years, I oversaw the daily operations of our college. 11 years as executive vice president. While the president was ill, I filled in for him for 11 years. And then I became president, and I oversaw the college for 11 more years. So for 22 years, I oversaw the daily operations of our college. And every morning for 22 years, 5 days a week, I would conduct a staff and faculty meeting before the first class every morning. One time for about 6 months, I took one morning per week, every week for about 6 months. And I taught the staff and faculty, I think it was 26 different things that the Bible teaches that you can do to get people to respect your opinion. And don't faint, I'm not going to teach all 26 of them this morning. But I am going to teach one. I'm going to give you the first one of the 26 that I taught the staff and faculty. What can you do? How can I get people to respect my opinion? Well, let me give you the first one that I taught them. They were not in any particular order. But turn to the book of Proverbs, if you would, please. Proverbs chapter 10, and we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'll be able to teach this one point in that about that 10-minute time. Proverbs chapter 10, and if you would please look at verse 19. Proverbs 10:19 says, I'm in Proverbs, and I'm in chapter 10, and I'm looking at verse 19. In the multitude of words there wanteth not, or we would say there's no lack of. In the multitude of words there wanteth not, or there's no lack of sin. But he that refraineth his lips is wise. You know what that verse is telling me? That verse is telling me the more I talk, the better chance I have of saying something I shouldn't have said. All right, now turn to Proverbs chapter 17. Proverbs chapter 17. We're just going to quickly look at 2 or 3 different verses here. Proverbs chapter 17, and I'm going to begin with verse 27. I'm in the 17th chapter of Proverbs. I'm beginning with verse 27. He that hath knowledge spareth his words. Can you look at me for a moment? Have you ever noticed when somebody seems to know what they're talking about, it doesn't take them very long to explain it to you? He that hath knowledge spareth his words. All right, let's continue reading. I'm in verse 27. And a man of understanding is of an excellent spirit. Can I admit something to you about myself? Can I confess a sin to you here this morning? Can I admit something to you that I have discovered about myself? Almost every time, and maybe every time, but at least almost every time I lose my temper, and I know that shocks you that I've ever done that, but I have once or twice in my lifetime. But every time I lose my temper, it seems like sometime later I look back on that situation and I realize the reason I lost my temper was I didn't fully understand everything that was going on. How many times have I looked back 3 months later, 3 minutes later, 3 weeks later, and thought, oh, that's what she meant by that. Oh, that's why he said that. Oh, he was dealing with that at the moment when he did that. And now that I understand what was going on, I realize I didn't need to lose my temper after all. He that has understanding, understands what's going on, is of an excellent spirit. All right, let's continue reading. Look at verse 28. Even a fool, when he holdeth his peace, or we would say keeps his mouth shut, even a fool, when he holdeth his peace, is counted wise. And he that shutteth his lips is esteemed a man of understanding. Does the name Dr. Bobby Robertson mean anything to any of you? Do any of you know that Dr. Bobby Robertson? He pastored in Walkertown, North Carolina. He pastored the largest church in the state of North Carolina for many years. They averaged over 3,500 in Sunday school. He pastored that church for 61 years. He and I were very close personal friends. And just like all of us older people in the latter years of his life, he had a few stories that he liked to tell over and over. And there was this one particular story I heard him tell several times, and I always enjoyed hearing it. He told how when he was a young preacher, he was at lunch one day in a restaurant with about 12 other preachers, and they were all young preachers except one. Dr. Harold Sightler. Does that name mean anything to you? He pastored in Greenville, South Carolina, a large church, Tabernacle Baptist Church, had a college and so forth. And Dr. Bobby Robertson told me that when Bobby Robertson was a very young man, they were sitting at the table and they were eating lunch, and the conversation at the table that day was that there was a young preacher down in Texas, a country preacher, who had built a large church in a place called Garland, Texas, Miller Road Baptist Church of Garland, Texas. A guy named Jack Hiles had been called to pastor a church in the inner city up in the north at a place called Hammond, Indiana. And they were talking at the table that day about, is this going to work for that southern country preacher that built a big church? Can he go up north in the middle of a big city and build another big church? And he said every young preacher at the table gave his opinion. But Dr. Sightler never said a word. He just kept right on eating. And Brother Bobby would always say, one of the young preachers finally said, Brother Sightler, you haven't said anything. What do you think? And he said, Brother Sightler never missed a bite. He just kept right on eating, and in between bites he said, if God's in it, it'll work. And just kept right on eating. When you know what you're talking about, it doesn't take you long to say it. All right, turn now, if you would, right quick to Proverbs chapter 29. Proverbs chapter 29, verse 11. Proverbs 29:11 says, a fool uttereth all his mind, but a wise man keepeth it in till afterwards. Now, one last place, Ecclesiastes, the very next book in the Bible, chapter 5. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, I'm going to read 2 verses and we'll wind this up. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and we're going to begin with verse 2. The next book in the Bible over from Proverbs, Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 2 says, be not rash with thy mouth. Now, when I hear the word rash, I think of some red little bumps on my skin that itch a lot. But that's not what that word rash means there. That word rash means don't do it in haste. Don't do it before you think. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. Well, where can you utter something that you're not before God? It said, don't be rash, don't be in a big hurry to say something in front of God. Well, where can you say something that you're not in front of God? Let's continue reading. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon the earth. Therefore, let thy words be few. Brother Hiles used to tell a story when he was a little boy, about 4 or 5 years of age. He was sitting on the floor playing. His mother was sitting in a chair with one of those round hoops with the cloth stretched over it, the different colored threads and the needles. What do you call that? Embroidering. She was embroidering. He was sitting on the floor and he was looking up at that from the bottom, and all he saw was different colored strings hanging down, different links, kind of tangled together. And he said, Mom, what are you doing? From down here, it just looks like a big mess. And she said, now, Jackie boy, you just keep playing, and when I get done, I'll bring you up here and let you see it from my viewpoint. And sure enough, later on, she said, now, Jackie boy, come up here. And she picked him up, put him in her lap, and he looked at it from the top, and it was a beautiful picture. And he come to find out all that time she had been following a pattern. Have you ever sort of in your heart looked up to heaven and said, God, what are you doing? From down here, this just looks like a big mess. One of these days, he's going to bring us up there and let us see it from his viewpoint. And then we'll realize he was following a pattern and he knew what he was doing. And that verse is telling us, don't say too much, too quick, in front of God, because God might know if you're accurate or not, because he's got a different viewpoint than you do. All right, let's continue reading. Look in verse 3. For a dream cometh through the multitude of business. Have you ever heard the phrase, a dream come true? Have you ever heard the phrase, the harder I work, the luckier I get? That verse is telling us if you want your dream to come true, it takes a multitude of business. It takes a multitude of work to get your dream to come true. My wife and I were in Thomas Edison's home one day. And no, he was not there the day that we were there. But my wife and I were in Thomas Edison's home one day, and they were giving us a tour. And they took us all through the first floor of the house. It was a typical house a family would live in. Then we went to the second floor, and I was shocked to find out that the second floor was one big open room. The whole second floor of the house was one big open room. And down this side of the room, there were 20 workstations. And down this side of the room, there were 20 workstations. I never knew this. I thought when Thomas Edison was trying to invent the light bulb that he was one scientist sitting in a dark corner fiddling with a light bulb, and when it wouldn't work, he threw it away and tried another one. But that was not the case. He had 40 full-time scientists all working for him, one working at each workstation on the side of the room, and each scientist had an assistant, and every time one of those men was working on a particular light bulb and he figured out this is not going to work, he would give it to the assistant, and the assistant would walk down to the end of the room, and there was a window, and they would toss it out the window. By the time they finished and got the light bulb invented, the broken glass had stacked up to the windowsill of the window on the second floor of the house. It took them tens of thousands of times to get it right. Thomas Edison had a dream. His dream was he could walk in a dark room in the middle of the night and do this. And it would be as light as day. It took a multitude of business to make that happen. All right, let's continue reading. Look at verse 3. For a dream cometh through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by multitude of words. You know what that verse is telling me? That the more I talk, I'm usually not displaying what I know. I'm usually revealing what I don't know. You ever get a group of people together that were supposed to be doing some work? You ever notice which one's doing the least work? The one doing the most talking. And you ever notice when you get a group together who seems to know the least about what he's talking about? The one who's doing the most talking. Now, I'll admit to you before I make this next statement that when I taught the staff and faculty of the college 26 things the Bible teaches that you can do to get people to respect your opinion, they liked point number 1 the least. Because point number 1 is, if you want people to respect your opinion, don't give it very often. The Bible clearly teaches that. Now, there are other times, and the Bible clearly teaches when you can and should give your opinion. But number 1, if you want people to respect your opinion, don't give it very often. All right, thank you very much.